You know that moment when you witness something that makes your blood boil? When someone crosses a line so far that you can't believe what you're seeing? Well, what happened at Gracie's diner on a quiet Tuesday morning wasn't just disrespectful. It was the kind of moment that changes everything. An 85-year-old veteran, minding his own business, gets slapped by a stranger. But here's the thing nobody saw coming. That old man's son happened to be a colonel in the U.S. Army, and when he showed up 30 minutes later with a convoy of soldiers in full-dress blues, well, let's just say respect got restored in a way nobody will ever forget. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you're not going to believe how this unfolds. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. This story is spreading everywhere, and for good reason. Now let me tell you exactly what happened. It was one of those Tuesday mornings where the heat already had its claws in the asphalt by 11:30, the kind that makes you grateful for air conditioning and cold drinks. Gracie's diner sat on the corner of Main and Fifth, like it had been there since the town was founded, probably because it had. The kind of place where the coffee was always hot, the pie was always fresh, and everybody knew everybody's business, whether they wanted to or not. Walt Turner pushed through the glass door with the same careful shuffle he'd perfected over 17 years of Tuesday mornings, 85 years old, but he carried himself like a man who'd learned early that posture meant something. His khakis were pressed sharp enough to cut paper, old habits from a lifetime of inspections that never really end. The shirt was tucked in with military precision, probably ironed that morning, with the same attention to detail he'd once given to his dress blues. But it was the cap that told the real story. Faded olive drab with the screaming eagle of the 101st. Airborne, the fabric soft from years of wear, but still proud on his grey head. That cap had seen things, jungle humidity that could drown a man, dust storms in places most people couldn't pronounce, and more funerals than any piece of cloth should have to witness. The bell above the door gave its familiar jingle as Walt made his way to his spot, corner booth by the window where the morning sun cut through in long, lazy beams. The kind of light that shows every speck of dust dancing in the air and makes even the most ordinary moment feel somehow sacred. He moved with the deliberate care of a man whose joints remembered every mile he'd ever marched, every jump he'd ever made, every night he'd spent sleeping on ground that wasn't meant for sleeping. Gracie Martinez looked up from behind the counter, her face breaking into the kind of smile that's earned through years of shared mornings. 50-something steel-grey hair pulled back in a bun that had gone out of style sometime in the 80s, but suited her just fine. She'd been pouring coffee in this place since before most of her customers were born, and she had that gift, rare in the service industry, of making everyone feel like they were coming home. "Morning, Walt," she called out, already reaching for the coffee pot that lived permanently in her right hand during breakfast hours. "The usual?" Walt settled into his booth with a small grunt of satisfaction, placing his worn leather wallet and a small spiral notebook on the scarred Formica table. The notebook was the kind you could buy at any drugstore for 99 cents, but this one was special, filled with careful handwriting in blue ink, dates and times for veterans events, phone numbers of old friends, reminders about memorial services. The kind of details that matter when you're one of the last ones left to remember. "You know it, Gracie," he replied, his voice carrying just a hint of the Arkansas drawl he'd never quite shaken, even after decades in Texas. "Black coffee, turkey, sandwich with that yellow mustard you hide behind the counter, and if you've got any of that apple pie left from yesterday." "Always got pie for you, Walt," she laughed, already moving toward his table with the kind of efficiency that comes from muscle memory. "Made fresh this morning, matter of fact. Had a feeling you'd be by." The diner hummed with its usual Tuesday rhythm. The couple in booth 3, regulars for the past decade, always ordered the same thing, never seemed to run out of things to talk about. The construction crew by the counter, hard hats stacked like a colorful monument beside their plates of eggs and bacon. The young mother trying to keep her toddler from dumping syrup on everything within reach while juggling her phone and what looked like a work call. Normal. Peaceful. The kind of American morning that soldiers have died defending without ever knowing they were defending it. But today wasn't going to stay normal. The rumble of a motorcycle engine cut through the diner's gentle morning soundtrack like a chainsaw through silk. Deep, loud, the kind of aggressive exhaust note that announces its owner long before they show up. Walt glanced up from his notebook as the sound grew closer, then shut off abruptly in the parking lot. Through the window, you could see the bike. Black and chrome, built more for intimidation than transportation, the kind of machine that costs more than most people make in 6 months, but somehow always looks like it's seen too many bar fights. Attached to it was its owner, and he was exactly what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play troubled drifter with anger issues. The man who walked through Gracie's door looked like he collected problems the way other people collected stamps. Mid-30s, maybe pushing 40, with the kind of face that made mothers cross the street with their strollers. Tattoos crawled up both arms, not the artistic kind that tell stories, but the prison yard variety that mostly just scream. Heavy boots that probably cost more than Walt's monthly pension stomped across the tile floor like he was trying to crack something. Underneath, his black leather jacket hung open over a stained t-shirt, and his jeans looked like they'd seen more miles than most truckers. But it was his eyes that really told the story. Small, mean, constantly scanning for weakness or disrespect, or any excuse to prove something to a world he was convinced owed him better. The kind of man who'd never served anything but himself. He claimed the table nearest the counter with the swagger of someone marking territory, helmet placed deliberately on the adjacent chair like a crown waiting for its king. His presence changed the atmosphere in the diner, the way a storm cloud changes a picnic. Suddenly, everyone was aware of where they were sitting, how loud they were talking, whether their backs were to the door. Gracie approached him with professional courtesy, coffee pot in hand. "Morning, what can I get you?" "Coffee," he grunted, not bothering to look up from his phone. "And whatever passes for breakfast in this tourist trap." She poured his coffee without comment, but Walt caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Gracie had been serving food to truckers and bikers and every kind of hard case Texas could produce for 3 decades. She'd developed radar for trouble, and right now her radar was pinging like a submarine in enemy waters. Walt went back to his notebook, writing carefully in his neat military script. He was planning the monthly memorial service at the VFW Hall. Nothing fancy, just a gathering to remember the boys who didn't make it home. Jimmy Rodriguez, from the 173rd Airborne, killed in Saigon in '68. Danny Sullivan from his own unit stepped on a mine outside Da Nang. Boys who'd been 19 and 20 years old when they died. Still boys in Walt's memory, despite the 50-plus years that had passed. The biker's voice cut through his thoughts like a rusty blade. "Look at this fossil." Walt's pen paused. He didn't look up, didn't react, but every veteran instinct he'd ever developed suddenly went on high alert. In Vietnam, you learned to recognize the sound of incoming trouble long before it arrived. It felt the same. Thinks he's still somebody with that ratty old hat. Now the diner was getting quiet. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they got softer, more careful. People started paying attention without appearing to pay attention. The survival skill of witnesses who'd rather not be witnesses. Walt continued writing. Memorial service, Sunday 2 p.m, coffee and donuts after. Simple, dignified, the way Danny would have wanted it. The biker's chair scraped against the floor as he turned to get a better look at his target. "Hey, Gramps," he called out, voice loud enough to make sure everyone heard. "That costume party you're heading to? Pretty sure Halloween's not for another few months." A few uncomfortable chuckles from somewhere behind Walt, the kind people make when they're nervous and don't know what else to do. The young mother hushed her toddler. The construction crew suddenly found their eggs fascinating. Walt looked up then, met the biker's eyes across the diner, with the steady gaze of a man who'd stared down worse things than a loudmouth with tattoos. For just a moment, the room held its breath. "Not a costume," Walt said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. "Uniform represents something. Still does." The biker's grin spread like oil on water. "Yeah? What's it represent? The good old days when you could push people around?" Walt's hands remained steady on his notebook. "Represents service, sacrifice, things some folks understand, some don't. Service," the biker snorted, standing now, his bulk casting a shadow, across several tables. "Service to what? Rich old men who sent poor kids to die in jungles nobody cares about anymore?" The words hit the diner like a physical blow. Gracie's coffee pot trembled slightly in her hand. The construction workers were actively avoiding eye contact now. Even the toddler seemed to sense the tension and went quiet. Walt closed his notebook, carefully, precisely the way he'd been taught to handle important documents. When he looked up again, his face was calm, but something in his eyes had changed. Not anger exactly, but a kind of Arctic certainty that made smart people take a step back. "Service to the men on my left and right," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "Service to people who wanted to come home to places like this." He gestured around the diner with one weathered hand. "To breakfast with friends, to arguments they didn't have to settle with bullets." The biker laughed, but it sounded forced now, like he was working too hard to maintain his performance. "Spare me the hero speech, old man. That war was over before I was born. Ancient history." "History's not ancient when you lived it," Walt replied, "and some lessons don't get old." Something about Walt's tone, not confrontational, not angry, just absolutely certain, seemed to push the biker past whatever line he'd been walking. His face flushed red above his scraggly beard, hands clenching into fists. "You know what your problem is?" he snarled, taking a step toward Walt's table. "You think that hat gives you special treatment, think it makes you better than regular people. Well, guess what, Grandpa? Your war's over. Your time's over. Nobody owes you anything anymore." Walt stood slowly, not threatening, just rising to his full height with the careful dignity of a man whose spine remembered how to stand. At attention. At 6 feet, he was still an inch taller than the biker, and something about the way he carried himself, straight-backed, balanced, ready, made the younger man hesitate for just a second. "Never asked for special treatment," Walt said quietly. "Just asked for basic respect, the kind any decent person shows their elders." "Respect?" The biker's voice cracked like a whip. "You want respect? Earn it." And then, faster than anyone expected, his hand shot out and slapped Walt Turner across the side of his head. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Walt's cap flew off, tumbling across the floor to land near the kitchen door like a fallen flag. For a moment that lasted forever, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound was the soft wheeze of the air conditioning and the distant hum of traffic outside. Walt stood perfectly still, one hand rising slowly to touch the spot where he'd been struck. His face showed no pain, no anger, just a kind of sad recognition, like he'd seen this exact moment coming from a long way off. He walked to where his cap lay, bent carefully, and picked it up, dusted it off with the same gentle precision he'd once used to clean his rifle, straightened the eagle, emblem with his thumb, placed it back on his grey head with the reverence of a man raising a flag. Then he looked at the biker with eyes that had seen Hanoi burn and watched friends die in mud and carried the weight of a war that never really ended. "That," he said quietly, "was a mistake." The biker puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his swagger, but something in Walt's voice made the attempt look hollow. "Yeah? What are you going to do about it, Fossil? Call the cops? Sue me?" Walt reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out an old flip phone, the kind that probably hadn't been manufactured in a decade, but still worked fine for making calls. He dialed a number from memory, waited for an answer. "David," he said, his voice steady as stone. "It's your father. I'm at Gracie's, and I think you should come down here. Bring the boys with you." He listened for a moment, then nodded. "No, son, not hurt. But someone needs to learn some manners, and I think you're better qualified to teach them than I am." He hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. The biker was still standing there, but his smirk had faded around the edges. "What are you going to do?" the biker demanded, but his voice had lost some of its thunder. "Call in the geriatric cavalry." Walt sat back down in his booth, picked up his coffee with hands that didn't shake, took a measured sip. "My son will be here in about 20 minutes, he said conversationally. "He's bringing some friends. They'll explain things better than I can." "Your son?" The biker laughed, but it sounded more nervous than amused. "What's he gonna do? Lecture me about respecting my elders?" Walt just smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, but somehow managed to be more unsettling than any scowl. Could be. Something like that. 27 minutes later, the first rumble reached the diner. It started as a vibration more than a sound, something felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. Like distant thunder, or maybe an earthquake. Except earthquakes don't usually announce themselves with such precise timing. Gracie was refilling Walt's coffee for the third time when the windows started to vibrate in their frames. The construction. Workers looked up from their plates, suddenly alert. The young mother instinctively pulled her toddler closer. Even the biker, who'd been sulking at his table and nursing his coffee like a grudge, lifted his head with the expression of a man who'd just realized he might have miscalculated something important. The rumble grew. Not louder, exactly, but deeper. More presence than noise. The kind of sound that speaks to something primitive in the human brain, the part that recognizes predators and natural disasters and other forces that don't negotiate. Through the window, you could see them coming. Down Main Street like something out of a movie. 4 Humvees, desert tan, and built like mechanical bulls moving in perfect formation. Behind them, a black SUV with government plates and windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors. And bringing up the rear, a vehicle draped in the stars, and stripes with 21st Infantry Regiment painted in gold letters on the side. The convoy pulled to the curb with military precision, engines rumbling at idle like caged beasts waiting for orders. Car doors opened in unison, not slammed, not rushed, but with the kind of coordinated movement that comes from years of training and shared purpose. The first man out of the lead Humvee was unmistakably Walt's son. Colonel David Turner stood 6'3" in his dress blue uniform, every ribbon and medal placed with the kind of precision that made jewelers weep with envy. His shoulders filled the doorframe as he entered the diner, and his eyes, the same clear grey as his father's, swept the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to assess threats in places where hesitation meant body bags. He'd inherited his father's jawline, but added 40 years of command responsibility to it. Desert campaigns had carved lines around his eyes, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he'd made the kind of decisions that kept other people awake at night. His chest displayed ribbons from Iraq, Afghanistan, and conflicts most civilians couldn't pronounce, each one representing months or years in places where the sunrise might be your last. Behind him came 12 soldiers in dress blues, moving, with the kind of synchronized precision that doesn't happen by accident. They filed through the door like pieces of a machine, each one finding their position without discussion or hesitation. Young men and women who'd volunteered to stand between America and whatever wanted to hurt it, now standing between an old veteran and a loudmouth who'd picked the wrong fight. The diner went dead silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight and presence and makes people remember their breathing. Even the toddler stopped fidgeting, staring wide-eyed at the uniformed figures who'd just transformed Gracie's from a neighborhood restaurant into something that felt like a courtroom. David Turner walked through the diner like he owned it, which in a way he did. Every step was measured, purposeful, the sound of polished boots on linoleum echoing like drum beats. He moved past the frozen construction workers, around the young mother who clutched her child like a shield, straight to the corner booth where Walt sat waiting with the patience of a man who'd called in exactly the right reinforcements. Walt stood as his son approached, coming to attention with the muscle memory of 1,000 morning formations. His hand rose in a salute that may have trembled slightly but never wavered, the gesture carrying 50 years of mutual respect between two soldiers who happened to share the same blood. David returned the salute crisply, then reached out to clasp his father's hand. "Sir?" he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made junior officers check their posture. "Report." Walt's voice was steady, matter of fact, the tone of a man giving testimony rather than filing a complaint. "Son, that individual there," he nodded toward the biker who now looked like he was calculating the distance to the nearest exit, "decided my cap and what it represents weren't worthy of his respect. He expressed his opinion by striking me across the head and knocking my cover to the floor." David's jaw tightened, but his expression remained controlled. "Professional." "I see," he said quietly. Then he turned to face the biker with the kind of look that made grown men remember their mother's advice about choosing fights carefully. The biker, for his part, had undergone a transformation. The swagger was gone. The sneer had evaporated. He sat hunched at his table like a man who just realized he was the punchline to a joke he didn't understand. His face had gone pale under his tattoos, and his hands were trembling slightly as they gripped his coffee cup. David approached him with the measured pace of a man who had all the time in the world and knew exactly how to use it. He stopped directly, in front of the biker's table, close enough to make it personal, but far enough to maintain the kind of professional distance that somehow made the moment more intimidating than any physical threat could have been. "Stand up," David said quietly. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really an order. It was simply a statement of what was going to happen next, delivered with the kind of certainty that made argument seem not just futile, but impossible. The biker stood, his legs unsteady, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for support that clearly wasn't coming. The 12 soldiers stood at attention behind David, not threatening, just present, a reminder that some institutions have weight and momentum that individual bluster can't match. "Do you have any idea?" David began, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that made people lean forward to listen. "What you've done here today?" The biker opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His tongue flicked across his lips like he was trying to taste words that wouldn't come. David continued, each word measured and deliberate. "You struck a man who volunteered to jump out of airplanes, in the middle of the night, behind enemy lines, so that people like you could sit in diners and drink coffee in safety." He took a half step closer. "You struck a man who spent 18 months in jungles that would have killed you in 18 hours, fighting an enemy that knew the terrain better than he knew his own backyard." The biker's Adam's apple bobbed as he tried to swallow. His hands were shaking openly now. "You struck a man who carried wounded soldiers through mud and blood and gunfire, who stayed awake for days to keep his unit alive, who came home to a country that called him names and spat on his uniform." David's voice never rose, never cracked, but it filled the diner like water filling a glass. "You didn't just assault an elderly gentleman, you assaulted everything that uniform represents. You assaulted every man and woman who ever wore it, every family that ever buried someone who died wearing it, every child who ever grew up without a parent because someone had to stand guard in the dark places of the world." By now, the biker was visibly trembling, his face grey with the dawning realization of exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. Around the diner, other patrons sat frozen, witnesses to a moment that would become family legend, the morning someone learned what respect meant the hard way. David gestured toward Walt's cap, which sat proudly on the old man's head. "That cap doesn't make him better than you," he said, his voice softening just slightly but losing none of its steel. "But what he did to earn the right to wear it does. And what you did here today, striking an unarmed 85-year-old man because you didn't like what his hat represented, that makes you exactly what every decent person hopes they'll never become." The silence stretched like a held breath. The biker's lips moved soundlessly, his eyes wide with something that might have been understanding or might have been terror. David reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a challenge coin, the kind military units give to members who've earned special recognition. He placed it on the table in front of the biker with the deliberate care of a man performing a ritual. "Pick it up," he said quietly. The biker's hands shook as he reached for the coin. It was bronze, heavy, with the 101st Airborne insignia on one side and the words "earned, not given" on the other. "Read it," David instructed. "She earned, not given," the biker stammered. "That's right," David said. "Earned, through sacrifice, through service, through standing up when it would have been easier to sit down and showing up when it would have been safer to stay home." He paused, letting the words sink in. Respect is the same way, earned, not given, and certainly not taken by force from people who've already paid more than their share. He gestured toward Walt. "Now walk over there and return his property." The biker looked confused. "His property?" "The respect you stole when you struck him," David explained with the patience of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. "You're going to give it back. You're going to apologize. Not because he needs your apology. He's stronger than your disrespect, but because you need to remember what human decency looks like." The biker's legs barely carried him the 10 feet to Walt's table. Each step looked like it required tremendous effort, as if he were walking through deep water or fighting a strong wind. When he reached the booth, he stood there swaying slightly, looking down at the old man who'd somehow summoned the U.S. Army with a single phone call. He began, then stopped, started again. "I'm sorry, sir, I was wrong, completely wrong." Walt looked up at him with those steady grey eyes, studying the younger man's face like he was reading a report. The biker's apology hung in the air between them, sincere in its terror, if nothing else. Finally, Walt nodded. "Apology accepted," he said quietly, "but not forgotten. You think about what happened here today. Think about why 12 soldiers dropped everything to come down here when an old man got disrespected. Think about what that means." The biker nodded frantically, eager to agree to anything that might get him out of this situation intact. "Yes, sir. I will, sir. I promise." "Good," Walt said. "Now get out of here before I change my mind about accepting that apology." The biker didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran to his table, threw money down without counting it, grabbed his helmet, and headed for the door at a pace that was just short of a sprint. The motorcycle roared to life outside, and within seconds the sound was fading into the distance as its owner put as many miles as possible between himself and Gracie's diner. David watched him go, then turned back to the soldiers who'd stood silent witness to the entire exchange. With a small nod, he dismissed them. They filed out as precisely as they'd entered, 12 professionals who'd just reminded everyone present that some institutions are bigger than individual ego, and some traditions are worth defending. As the last soldier disappeared through the door, David sat down across from his father, suddenly looking less like a commanding officer and more like a son checking on his dad. "You okay, Pop?" he asked, his voice softer now, the authority replaced by genuine concern. Walt smiled, the lines around, his eyes deepening, I'm fine, son. Been hit harder by my own shaving razor. He paused, studying his son's face. Appreciate you coming down here, though, and bringing the cavalry. Always, Dad, David replied. Nobody touches my father. Nobody disrespects what you sacrificed. Not on my watch. Gracie appeared at their table as if summoned, coffee pot in hand and tears in her eyes. Coffee, Colonel? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. That'd be great, Gracie, David replied, accepting the cup with a grateful nod. And thank you for calling me. Some things can't wait for the authorities. Seemed like the right thing to do, she said, wiping her eyes with her apron. Walt's family here, all our veterans are. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, father and son, veteran and active duty, sharing coffee in a diner that had suddenly become hallowed ground. Around them, other patrons began to return to their breakfasts, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were quieter, more respectful. People looked at Walt differently now, not just as the nice old man who always sat by the window, but as a living piece of history who'd earned every grey hair on his head. You know, Walt said finally, that young man might just learn something from today. David raised an eyebrow. You think so? Maybe, Walt replied, taking a sip of his coffee. Sometimes people need to see what they're up against before they understand what they're fighting. He saw what happens when you disrespect something bigger than yourself. Might make him think twice next time. And if it doesn't, Walt's smile was sharp as a blade, then he'll probably be smart enough to do his thinking somewhere else. David laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Somehow I doubt he'll be back. No, Walt agreed, looking out the window at the spot where the convoy had been parked. I don't think he will. The morning sun was climbing higher now, filling the diner with golden light that made everything look softer around the edges. Walt finished his turkey sandwich, David worked on his coffee, and Gracie bustled around ensuring everyone else was taken care of. It could have been any Tuesday morning at any diner in America except for the story that would be told and retold. Until it became legend, because respect isn't just a word, it's a force of nature. And sometimes it takes the quiet strength of an old soldier and the unwavering loyalty of the family he raised to remind the world that some things are worth standing up for. As David prepared to leave, he clasped his father's shoulder. I've got to get back to base, Dad. You sure you're okay? Walt nodded, his cap sitting proudly on his head where it belonged. Right as rain, son. Thanks for the backup. Any time, Pop. Any time. David stood, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the door with the same measured pace he'd used entering. But before he left, he turned back to address the diner. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet space. What you witnessed here today was a reminder. This country was built by people who served something larger than themselves, people who put duty before comfort, service before self-interest, and respect before personal gain. That man over there, he gestured toward Walt, represents all of them. Remember that. Then he was gone, leaving behind a diner full of people who would never forget the morning an old veteran got slapped. And the U.S. Army showed up to set things right. Walt finished his pie in peaceful silence, left his usual 20% tip, and walked to the door. As he passed each table, conversation stopped. Hands lifted in small waves or nods of respect. The construction workers stood as he passed. The young mother whispered, "Thank you," just loud enough for him to hear. At the door, he turned back to Gracie. "See you Thursday, darling. And save me some of that apple pie. I have a feeling Thursday's going to be a good day." He pushed through the door into the Texas heat, walking slowly but steadily toward his old pickup truck. The screaming eagle on his cap caught the sunlight as he climbed behind the wheel, and for just a moment you could see him as he'd been 50 years ago, young, strong, ready to jump out of airplanes in defense of people he'd never met. That evening, the story began to spread. Social media lit up with shaky cell phone videos and breathless accounts. "Biker slaps veteran, army arrives" became the headline that launched 1,000 shares. But the real story wasn't in the videos or the viral posts. The real story was in the reminder that respect is earned through service, sacrifice, and the quiet strength to stand up when it matters. It's in the understanding that some people carry the weight of history in their hearts and deserve to be honored for that burden. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice arrives not with sirens and handcuffs, but with the measured tread of polished boots and the unwavering certainty that some lines should never be crossed. Because in the end, Walt Turner didn't just get his respect back that morning. He reminded an entire diner, and eventually an entire country, what respect really means and why it's worth defending. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why veterans deserve our gratitude and respect, take a moment to share it. Drop a comment below and tell us about a veteran in your life who deserves recognition. Hit that subscribe button because these stories matter and they need to be told. Our veterans carried the weight of freedom so we could carry the weight of choice. The least we can do is carry the weight of remembrance. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time with another story that proves the same truth over and over. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And once earned, it's defended by people who understand that some things are worth fighting for.